So, welcome back everyone to our third lecture this afternoon. This morning we looked at praise and worship music and its origins, and in the second lecture we looked at the eschatological participation in the throne room as a metaphor. In the third lecture, that's the last one of today, we changed the perspective a little bit and talk more about the theology that is expressed in the lyrics and expressed in worship. And I'm happy that Adam Perez, Professor for Worship Studies at Belmont University, is here with us, and we're looking forward to your third lecture, Adam.
Let me welcome to you all and to those of you online as well. Thanks for being here. So we began by exploring the biblical and theological commitments that are woven in the history of contemporary praise and worship music, such that today it's commonplace to assume that musical worship is able to make God present to worshipers in a special way. So I invited us to consider a few small ways we might check in with ourselves and those theological traditions about that basic assumption. Do we agree? If so, how? In my second lecture, I explored the way contemporary worship songs continue to mobilize a spatial and spiritual connection between worship of the Old Testament, worship today, and also in the eschaton, and particularly in the throne room of heaven. And I concluded by considering what broader context of or situation in the book of Revelation might make it possible for us to understand that our worship is a participation in the worship of heaven, or prefigures the worship of heaven. For this lecture, I've taken my title, Goodness of God, from the popular song, Goodness of God. And I'm interested here in what appears to be the vanishing act for human experience. Where is the place for the rich texture of human experience in contemporary worship music? No one song can, of course, embody the whole range of human experience, and perhaps it wouldn't be a good thing to try to do that in one song. But songs like Goodness of God pick up on the confidence of the psalmists in God's unfailing love, and rightly so. This is a good thing. But today I'm concerned with the broader practice of contemporary worship that seems to have made the act of praise the only way of engaging with God in worship. I know many contemporary critics share this concern, and I'm concerned in particular with the confidence, perhaps even overconfidence, of sentiments like these ones that we hear in Goodness of God. All my life you have been faithful. All my life you have been so good, emphatically good. With every breath that I am able, I will sing of the goodness of God. And it isn't the case that these words are just not true in a hopeful or aspirational sense. Sometimes worship proclaims the future that we hope to live into. But I want to suggest to you that there is a cultural temptation to allow them to stand in, to allow these sentiments to stand in for a more honest and more biblically inspired engagement with God. I'm worried that these sentiments short-circuit a fully human relationship with God by severely limiting the vocabulary of what's appropriate to say to God. And my critique isn't of this song in particular, or this song alone. It's just one song, just one example. But of a whole church culture which songs like these represent. And I guess what I'm really trying to say is that I'm interested in the possibility of worship music that tells the truth in a way that reflects the diverse testimony of the Psalms and the people of Israel, and in a way that reflects the experience of Christ as the one who suffered. That these might be scriptural resources for offering our worship to God as people who are complex, people who are in pain, as people who also have great joy and great hope, but also have deep wounds. So I want to start with an anecdotal reflection about my own experience and a story I think I began to mention When I was a student in university, I had an existential crisis as a worship leader. I wasn't sure that I believed theologically in some of the songs that I was being asked to sing and lead in worship. So I decided to do some digging, and I proposed a project for school that intended to look at the previous 10 years of Hillsong songs and identify in those songs the potential variety of worship functions of each song. What could each song embody in a worship service and a liturgy? I was coming from a church context where it was kind of assumed that there would be different kinds of songs for different kinds of ways of engaging with God. Songs that praise, but also songs that do confession, and songs that do assurance of pardon, songs that were for prayer, songs that were for thanksgiving, songs that serve these various functions in worship. And while that school project, that review of songs, didn't yield conclusions that would save the church or heal its wounds or be especially profound, as an undergraduate work sometimes is not profound. I did learn in that process that I wasn't exactly asking the right questions. You see, my study showed that the vast majority of the songs were, categorically speaking, songs of praise. They celebrated the goodness and mercy and love of God, perhaps to a fault. What I didn't realize at the time was that I was asking somewhat of a naive question about this repertoire. What I asked was, how many of these songs aren't just praise songs? And maybe what I should have been asking was, why does mainstream contemporary praise and worship music only have one theological or emotional gear? Why do contemporary worship songs, especially the most popular ones, seem to only be songs of praise that hardly mention, the hardship and experience, and when they do, they view them in the rear-view mirror. It's always hardship that happened before, and now I'm this new situation. I notice about these songs that, yes, trouble has always already been overcome. It's like they skip to the ending. And so I should have seen this coming. I should have, anticipated this. After all, I spent many mornings listening to Christian radio on my way to school with my mom in the car. Our radio station channel is called K-Love. And the tagline for K-Love is positive, encouraging K-Love. So you would expect that this station that is safe for the whole family would be playing songs like that, right? Indeed, the popular Christian radio is out there to brighten up otherwise pedestrian aspects of our life. Sitting in traffic, sitting at the computer, doing chores around the house, things that are not especially lively. And so today in my lecture, I want to explore some of the theological and musical industrial contexts that create limitations on how contemporary praise and worship music engages us emotionally. How these things put limits on the range of emotions that are possible within the culture of worship music today. And I want to do this both so that we understand this culture better, and I hope use these songs better, but also so that we can critique it and help it lead us into a fuller life of faith. I'll close with some reflections on the challenges that creates for worship that might express a fuller humanity and a fuller biblical witness to our engagement with God as people of God. As I said, I'm interested in worship that tells the truth about God, to God about human experience. So first, the theological culture of worship as a limiting factor. The theological culture consists, at least in part, in a twofold assumption about how worship music works, by drawing a boundary around what right worship does for us emotionally. First, praise changes your perspective, and second, praise changes the atmosphere. And I'll treat each of these two they're very connected, but try to treat them in turn. So first, praise changes your perspective. This common phrase that I often hear, both historically in the primary sources that we've been working with today, but also in the present, is the idea that when you focus on God through praise and thanksgiving, you don't focus on your problems. So instead, you're focusing on God. And experientially, I think this is very true. When we shift our attention to God and what God has done, sometimes the challenges of our lives, they get a little bit smaller, and we put them into this larger landscape. This can be good and encouraging for us to put all our hope in and on God, the deliverer, especially when our problems may actually be relatively small. You can think of a song like Goodness of God, as I've begun to explore already, but let's look at another recent one that models this as well. Maverick City's Gyra. Is Maverick City popular here too? Is this okay? I assume so, but I feel like I should always ask. So you know this song, and let's take a look here. Actually, I'm going to play a little bit of this song. If we can mute the live stream. Apologies to the live stream folks. This song is a powerful affirmation of the otherness of God, of the sovereignty of God, of the unconditional love of God, and our delight in God. Let's listen to this intro and then into verse 1. So. This sentiment, I think, is a beautiful and true sentiment, but perhaps one that doesn't quite acknowledge the very real alternative, perhaps even the reason why such a sentiment would be comforting, that God is this way even though the world is not this way. It's so close to actually naming the pain of when, for example, someone withdraws or withholds their love from us. And I think there remains this gap, I think, between naming God's love and naming our pain. And this song is just very, very close to bridging that gap, but doesn't do the latter, just the former. Let's look at verse 2 as well, just the text here. Going through a storm, but I won't go down. I hear your voice carried in the rhythm of the wind to call me out. You would cross an ocean so I wouldn't drown. You've never been closer than you are right now. These are powerful affirmations, but they don't attend to the very real situation of the issue. Praise changes our perspective. It distracts us from the storm, from the fear of drowning. How might this kind of confidence in the face of a vague challenge actually end up subverting a greater power, the power of acknowledging, lamenting, naming the injustice, of telling God that our situation isn't right and that we want God to do something about it? I wonder, does that subtle shift make our praise incomplete or not fully honest? Or to use a more colloquial term, does our praise become less authentic, less true to us? The chorus continues, Gyra, you are enough. I will be content in every circumstance. Now, notice here, and this is common again across the contemporary worship music repertoire, that there is a move to contentedness without identifying and acknowledging the reality of the problem and offering it to God. And by extension, neither does it seek resolution from God. Instead, the song, and so many like it, give us words of affirmation in a generic sense of God's power and love. Does God actually want us to be content in every circumstance? What if that circumstance is injustice? Do we just say, Jesus, take the wheel? That seems to be what the culture of contemporary worship invites us, teaches us to do, to say to God. And to be fair, I think many of the challenges of our lives don't have clear resolutions, and that's very real as well. Nevertheless, when and where, if not in our worship music, as it helps us dialogue with God, are we honest about our situation with God and able to acknowledge our pain, our discontent? We see it, not all the time, but regularly, when we look at the praise of the Psalms and the prophets, and yet we don't see it in our worship music today. So that's the first of this twofold theological assumption: praise changes our perspective. The second one is that praise changes the atmosphere. So it isn't only that praise changes something in you, changes your perspective, that it also might change something about the situation, about the atmosphere that you're in, that it has power. Praise has power to do these things. I explored in my first lecture the idea that God inhabits praise. That is, that where praise happens, God becomes present in a special way. And of course, generations of worship teachers have been expanding on that basic notion from Psalm 22:3. So the extension here is that when God becomes present, God doesn't just show up and do nothing. God shows up in a powerful way, in an active way. God is going to do something when God shows up. A key verse on this theology of praise changing the atmosphere is Acts 16:25 and following, the story where Paul and Silas, praising from prison, and their bonds were released or broken, is a common, and perhaps also another common one here is Daniel 3, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego weren't burned in the fiery furnace. Idea that in these cases, praise was the thing that changed the situation for them. And beyond these biblical proof texts, I think the experiential testimony that a sense of God's presence is powerful in our lives is a powerful witness. Praise does spiritual work that creates possibilities. There's an open-endedness, an ambiguity to this that is, I think, proper and good to understand about the uncontrollability of God's Spirit. Yet praise is often invoked like a kind of spiritual invisible hand over a spiritual economy. Praise changes the atmosphere, is intimately connected to with the concept of praise as spiritual warfare, which we'll get to tomorrow in the lecture. On one hand, praise provides a change toward a positive emotional situation. Instead of just distracting us from our problems, we take our needy selves to God, and in offering praise, the feeling of the situation changes. It puts us on a trajectory toward contentedness, as we saw in the lyrics of Jireh. Not only that it does so, but that it must do that for us to experience it as worship. In this context, the contemporary worship context, when worship is at its best, its most true, its most authentic, the worshiper feels empowered. On the other hand, the sentiment that something is actually changing, spiritually speaking, out in the world. The worshiper experiences a breakthrough, or the roadblock they've encountered in life is promised to be removed. Think of a song like Waymaker that embodies this theme well. God is powerfully present and working to change this atmosphere or situation. Beyond the title of the song, Waymaker, that God makes a way when there seems to be no way, see how God is working in the verses. You are here moving in our midst. I worship you, I worship you. You are here working in this place. I worship you, I worship you. And in later verses, God is touching every heart, healing every heart, turning lives around, mending every heart. God is doing something with us and in us. And in the bridge, Even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. And I should say the bridge is not by Sinak, but a later addition, because, the history here matters to me. Maybe just to me, but it matters to me. In good Pentecostal fashion, this song imagines a God who's changing the condition of things in and around us, even if our senses can't quite distinguish or acknowledge it. So whether we sense a change in the atmosphere through worship or not, there is that latent expectation in contemporary praise and worship music of a positive emotional or spiritual change that God is enacting or doing through and specifically because of our praise. I'm suggesting here that this expectation limits our capacity for expressing and acknowledging a fuller range of human experiences. It limits the lingering of pain, of hurt, without pressuring us to completely turn to a spiritual resolution or a weak confidence in God's ongoing activity. What power is procured or accessed in these kinds of expressions of worship? That is not where power is for praise and worship. Connected to these sensibilities is the often quoted and biblical appeal to the fact that our struggle is not with flesh and blood or flesh and bone, but with the powers and principalities. And I think this is true, but this spiritualization creates an unnecessary and overwrought divide between the spiritual and the material or physical. Now, that is a big theme you should take into your other Bible and theology classes, but I just want to make the disclaimer here that there's a long legacy of interpretation in Christian theology that perhaps unnecessarily divorces these spiritual and material elements. A question and issue that I think we need to continue to revisit in worship practice and in discussions about worship. I will address that tomorrow a bit as well. So that is some of the theological limitations, what praise does for us. And beyond those theological contours that shape this tradition and its lack of diverse expression, there are also industrial forces that limit our engagement with God. It's no mystery that there is a worship music industry that shapes what songs we sing in churches and in chapels. I bring this up because this reality and the potential way it limits our worshipful engagement with God because of this simple question, really, which is what sells? How does the industry doing what industry does, that is, pursue profit, shape the world of worship music and, by extension, our worship practices? The first way that industry profit shapes the emotional limits of contemporary worship extends from the basic question of all capitalist consumerist industry, that question of what sells. To answer that question for us, positivity sells. I joked earlier about being a listener of positive, encouraging K-Love as a teenager, but it's more than just a simple marketing tactic. The industry of positivity within Christianity includes, but it's not limited to, what sociologist Christian Smith calls moral therapeutic deism, as well as, in Pentecostalism especially, the health and wealth prosperity gospel, or what Kate Bowler has described as soft prosperity. God wants you to feel blessed, the idea that God wants you to feel happy and blessed. So we might answer this question at the outset by saying that worship music that makes people feel happy or vaguely hopeful, and I say vaguely because often there is a lack of a referent to what hope is drawn on other than just Jesus, vaguely hopeful, that kind of music is worship music that sells. This works in two directions. First, that the prosperity gospel is in some form embedded in the culture of contemporary praise and worship music. And to be fair, in many segments of charismaticism, Pentecostalism, evangelicalism. I mean, as far as American Christianity goes, it's pretty much everywhere, and that influence then spills over globally. We see this through song texts like the ones we've been exploring already, ones that highlight triumph, that highlight positive feelings. So to say, theologically speaking, the push to feel positive through praise is embedded in the very fabric of the worship music theology and culture. Positive worship music sells, and worship songwriters are inevitably participants in a profit-bearing industry. The industry is built such that songwriters need to write songs that sell. Since the professionalization of the worship songwriter in the mid-1990s, the livelihood of a songwriter is based on a need to be successful in a consumer market. This is a long-discussed challenge for Christians in the music industry, and it's been navigated in complex ways. It's not any one songwriter's fault, and I don't mean to condemn the act of making a living as a Christian songwriter. I think that's great, and if you want to do that, awesome. But it's a reality of the situation, and each part of the equation, both the creators and the consumers, share some complicity in this consumer capitalist market. I bring this up because I'm trying to name here the power of wealth and economic power in a consumer culture to shape the priorities of the church at large. It is also important to note how the global capitalist consumer economy has been utilized by the Pentecostal charismatic sources of worship music to continue to shape the global transnational worship music sound and identity, as we've been talking about in the class. Beyond the music, there are a number of recent concerns also that we can be aware of. For example, a colleague of mine, Kelsey Kramer McGinnis, recently published an article in Christianity Today magazine exploring some of the financial side of these issues, including the fact, and I think this is a fascinating development that we should think a lot about, that some worship songs have begun to appear in investment portfolios. So the profit of worship songs being purchased by companies or groups that create investment portfolios, under the assumption that these songs will continue to bear profit for a long, reliable future. And maybe you've also heard recently, last year really, about the controversy about trademarking the term worship leader. The particular company that felt that it had a trademark over that term as it regards certain kinds of resources for the church. So protecting a trademark really as an industrial, profit-bearing kind of move. So another way that worship music and its larger apparatus is embedded in these kinds of concerns and networks. This is, and these things are not unique to the worship music industry. It's really an extension, a consequence of worship music existing in the broader music industry. But it does now pose new and interesting questions, I think, for worship music in particular. The second reality, or the reality that contented or vaguely hopeful music sells, is related to the second aspect of how the music industry shapes emotional limits. That is, the loose construction of contemporary worship music as a genre, or as a limited set of subgenres, both theologically and musically. It has been documented, for example, that global brands like Hillsong intentionally began writing for a vague global audience. And I don't want to get too much into the details and mechanics of music here, or the historical establishment of worship music as a genre, but just to say the construction of worship music as a genre has created the possibility of this question, which is, what does good or right worship music sound like to our ears? What does it sound like? In the mainstream of popular worship music, there have been waves of subtle shifts in style from, as we talked about, the Jesus People, the folk and rock sounds of the 1970s, to the orchestral sounds that we heard in the earlier lecture today, to the guitar-wielding singer-songwriter of the late 1990s, sort of Matt Redman, to Hillsong's imitation of U2 and the wall of sound effect, to, in recent years, the pop synth styles that, feel at home on pop radio. Now, of course, there are also many local instances of worship music in countries like Germany. What does an authentic worship music sound for German listeners, for German worshipers? What does that sound like? And who gets to decide what those things sound like as they get marketed to certain audiences. Because these musical configurations operate at the level of genre, they shape worshipers' musical and emotional expectations for what good and right worship music sounds like. While once the acoustic guitar sounds of a song like "Open the Eyes of My Heart" was the sound of true, authentic worship, perhaps now the synth rock style pop ballad of Bethel Music's "Goodness of God" or Maverick City's "Gyra" rings more faithfully in and true in our ears. Maybe it's Alive Worship's, whatever they're doing. I don't even know how to describe it musically, but maybe it's what they're doing that sounds to you all like a more true and authentic worship. You see, the industry and the community of contemporary worship requires these shifts to remain interesting and relevant to consumers, new and old, in a context that tolerates very little artistic ingenuity and creativity. So these shifts between, I'm talking about folk and rock and orchestral, and these developments over time, they're important for the genre or for the industry to sustain itself. As a genre, as is the case with most every genre, songs have to be recognizable to the genre's audience, even while they introduce novelty in some form to generate interest in that particular song. This generally means also producing and distributing a lot of songs that sound very similar. The ongoing construction and maintenance of this genre of the sound of worship and its consumer audience sets an emotional limit. And this style and emotional limit as worship music becomes a theological one insofar as it shapes our engagement with God. To put it another way and put it more simply, just to say musical style is theological. So what musical style is fitting to the praise of God? Again, that sound at the moment tends toward these synth and guitar pop rock power ballads. And if you don't mind, I'll get a little bit nerdy about the music for a moment, for just a moment on the music. In contemporary praise and worship music, and this came up in our class a little bit, it seems that texture and orchestration have become more important than melody or harmonic interest, the melody or harmony. The sound of Western popular music reigns supreme with our associations of things like major keys with the happy and minor keys with the sad. Among the most popular songs, I don't think there are any that are primarily written in a minor key. To the ear, the sound of praise already imagines the extent of its limits and its audience. It's a happy sound, it's a positive sound. Or at least the emotional breadth is dampened or limited in exchange for emotional height, as that's achieved through drops and builds in the intensity of the music. Indeed, few minor chords are used in general, except as a kind of pressure valve release during a bridge or before launching back into the triumphant chorus in the major key. So again, to have that sort of minor sound in the rearview mirror, it's behind us as we move triumphantly toward a concluding chorus or something. It is just tension that's introduced so that it can be resolved, so that we can have that feeling of as we move back into the major key. They act as a kind of straw man to be crushed by the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. It's something that, I actually wrote the German down here, but I'm not going to try to read that song. But you know the song Reckless Love, I think? It has that rollicking, rolling effect toward resolution. It starts with tension and every line moves toward that musical resolution, which I think is a fascinating musical form for doing what happens in worship. We're always moving toward resolution, and we always get there. We don't ever head toward resolution and almost get there. we always resolve. So, end of my nerdy soapbox on the musical style. So I've explored two theological limitations and two industrial limitations that have made the emotional bandwidth of contemporary worship, I think, rather narrow in its focus. I want to affirm here that it's not a fault of these songs individually and specifically, but of our entire repertoire of congregational singing and the apparatus in which that congregational singing exists. There's a theological and cultural anemia that impacts sung worship, But the same could be said of practices of preaching and prayer. What explicit and implicit boundaries exist beyond music around how contemporary worship engages emotionally with God? How do preaching and practices of prayer reinforce assumptions about what's good and right to say to God in preaching and prayer? Where is that space for a more honest and biblically rich emotional engagement? As I said earlier, I'm interested in a worship practice that tells the truth better. So how might worship music do that? Let's bring these two elements, theology and industry, together for a brief moment and ask a somewhat simple question, which is this: whose worship music is this? Or whose perspective and experience is centered and celebrated in this kind of emotionally narrow contemporary praise and worship context? My sense is that worship songs that only celebrate the goodness of God is the perspective of the privileged. In the US context, at least, that shapes contemporary praise and worship music globally or participates in shaping it. The privileged are generally wealthy and white. Of course, it isn't that I also identify as white and Hispanic. The complexity of race becomes complex. It's not that we don't have struggles to offer to God, but it's from that context in whole or in part that people can say that spiritual and material blessings go hand in hand, that life goes from glory to glory, that your problems are actually small enough that they can be ignored with a simple change of perspective. But I think it's only when our worship songs are able to honestly tell the story of suffering that they can claim the fullness of the life and faith of Jesus, a Jesus who suffered before he was resurrected, a Jesus that still has his scars. A second related question emerges: who benefits from this situation of emotional, narrow worship music, where there is a lack of awareness at best or an intentional displacement at worst of the real hurt in the world? Is that not the oppressor's song? Is contemporary worship today one that just quells the masses instead of empowering them, enabling them toward their freedom in Christ to overcome the power of sin, death, and evil in the world? We can't sing David's psalms of praise without also acknowledging David's story as a person on the run. We can't sing those psalms without acknowledging a death-dealing and adulterous culture that he lives in, without acknowledging the struggle of the wilderness journey of the people of God. Of all of these things, we need a contemporary worship culture that can sing and be in solidarity with, in my case, migrant kids who are in cages, refugees that are in rafts, prisoners who hold fast to the promise that freedom is yet on its way. Culture change is big and hard, but it begins, I think, with being honest about our situation. And as my colleague at Belmont, David Dark, says, we become what we normalize. So what are we willing to normalize? I want to close with a few suggestions, and of course I've already been presenting some suggestions, but a few more suggestions perhaps for pressing through the emotional and music industrial boundaries of contemporary praise and worship. And my thesis here is that if we want worship that tells the truth, we need to be specific about our time and place and all the mess that is. To linger in our worship with God in the reality of the world as it is, and not just wallpaper over it with lofty words of praise. And there, in the midst of that, find our hope in the story of God's acts of salvation in history and scripture. I think we need songs that tell a more specific story of somewhere. And actually, I mentioned Hillsong moving toward a more vague and general audience in their writing. Before the sort of, late 1990s, early 2000s, Hillsong was really interesting in one way that it wrote from a clearly Australian perspective. In fact, one of their albums was called God's Great, or maybe it was just a very popular song on one of the albums called God's Great Southland. They were writing for an Australian context and eventually kind of moved away from that directly. I think that was a loss in some kind of way. It enabled their global significance, but it was a loss on the local level, no longer articulating particularity of their culture. And perhaps even the risk there for them, or the payoff, was moving away from particularity toward consumer capitalist growth, right? So to move to that vague general audience is to move toward a bigger market, which was intentional. So something to think about there. I love the work of local songwriting, not just because of its homegrown and it exists somewhat outside of industrial structures, never really exists outside of industrial structures, but in part because it has the potential to be true to a local community of Christians, to do more than just offer us the infinitely reproducible Christian karaoke cover band experience. In Scripture, it seems that true worship emerges from specific contexts, from burning bushes to watering holes to throne rooms even, that these are real places and we would do well to lean in and find our place in God's story through our places and then to sing them. Drawing on my second lecture and pointing to tomorrow's lecture, we need to reform, I think, our eschatology in worship. We need to reinvigorate our imagination for Christian hope in the world. In so many contemporary worship songs, there's that vague sense of happiness that is marketed as Christian hope. It's a feeling, marketed as a feeling. And instead, I think we need to put that story back together to re-embody the future God imagines through the prophets, through the book of Revelation, to re-embody our spirituality in contemporary worship so that this spiritual and material are not disconnected but are more deeply connected. And I think we need to tell the story of the whole Christ, not just the part where his death saves us from sin or his resurrection confirms his divinity. We just listened to Hymn of Heaven in class, this sort of turn in the fourth verse of a hymn that this song is building its patterning after, or like in Christ Alone, this triumphal moment where we get to celebrate the resurrection. But instead, sing songs that tell the story of the suffering that marks Christ's journey toward death in the first place, of the betrayal of those once trusted, of the final meals before leaving his friends. Like Thomas, at the invitation of Christ, we need to press into Christ's open wounds and scars. When we claim the faith of Jesus as the one who suffers alongside us, we don't have to shy away from the open wounds and the wounds of the people around us, I think. So, to conclude, exceeding the emotional limits of contemporary praise and worship towards these kinds of hopes that I've been naming means decentering praise, moving praise out of the center of being the exclusive act of contemporary worship music. And my hope is that by pressing on these emotional limits, that it allows us to be more fully human, allows us to be more fully and honestly engaged with God and with one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, once more for your interesting observations about our worship culture. I think it is important to self-reflect the theology that is expressed in our worship songs, and maybe there's a monotony there that we need to address. And also the question of, like, why is there a hit list of the 100 most listened worship songs on CCLI, and that's also, without reflection, we just use these songs, reuse these songs in our services, and that might be problematic. Thank you a lot. That gives a lot to think about. Other questions from the audience, and also, of course, those online. I remind you, you can also ask questions through the chat. Yeah. Function. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think related to this question of popular song lists, it's interesting that for at least a century, if not longer, evangelicals, charismatic Pentecostals, they have looked to the market to to confirm God's blessings. To say, we know this thing is blessed by God because it has been commercially successful. And that's a really tricky space. And the logic of a top song list plays on that. Oh, because this is popular, it seems it is actually, in fact, blessed by God somehow, right? It's very hopeful in the market's powers. Again, existing in that consumer capitalist framework.
Yeah, I was wondering about this whole range of emotions, and I was thinking of a few German songs that actually do have stuff like that, like Ich habe keine Lust zu beten, I'm not in the mood to pray today. That is in our in one of the songbooks, in one of the popular songbooks, but actually using that in a service is kind of weird.
Yeah. An opening song. I'm not in the mood to pray today. Here I am. How's the song end? Does it end
It
just
actually
stays
goes
there?
the Here I am is actually what kind of the emotion. Let's just talk. I'm not in the mood to pray. Let's just talk.
Oh, I see. That's okay. Maybe
That's-
different, slightly.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
but it plays on a real emotion, and I think it's
Yeah.
that I didn't sing it as often as other songs, and I think there's a reason for it. So that's what I'm going for. My question is, do you think that using the whole range of emotions in service is actually, does that work? And is it problematic that I wonder if it works, if only, can I be only happy in public? So I'm actually asking myself that right now. So yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I think, of course, the problem is much larger than just with contemporary worship music in particular. What emotions am I allowed to feel publicly is a great question. And I think one of the interesting things about this repertoire is we have said that we're happy to pretend to be vaguely positive about God as a way of being faithful or expressing our faithfulness to God, when it doesn't seem, at least to me, that that's an especially biblical way of being in the world. Like I don't know if there's a proof text even for folks saying like, no, it's good that we only use positive emotions in worship. But when we come from the place, and we've been talking about in the class too, this church growth impulse or the idea of attractional worship music, I mean, it's also true of us culturally that we don't like to be around people who are like dour and sad all the time and whatever, right? So I don't think the idea is that like our whole service would, just hang out in a sort of like things are bad, I'm sad the whole time or something. But that it gives us opportunities because people are engaging, because people's lives are so different. To take seriously that not everyone is happy. Like that we know is true about our communities. So where are the places where there's opportunity to speak about a very real life experiences and perhaps also still sing these other songs that are true, but we're not monotonous with it as the word you used, that there's more on offer emotionally than just the positive thing. But again, because in part our church growth logic of like people, we can't attract people with sad things, which I think is maybe not even true in general. I think there's more to say there, but that happy things are attractional, positive things are attractional. We're starting with that impulse insofar as we incorporate contemporary worship, which isn't, a solution really to saying, how do we feel sad in public in a way that feels okay and doesn't feel embarrassing or whatever, but at least to recognize that it's worship is a space where maybe we can open that up a little bit and actually inform our broader cultural life, because it's a place where the leaders are functionally like in charge of what everyone's doing. You can invite people into a musical space that's different than just saying like, okay, everyone, will you turn to your neighbor and tell them about, something that you talked to your therapist about this week, or tell them about a really bad, sad feeling you have right now. We wouldn't do it like that. But in music, music opens up different kinds of possibilities of relating. So I think it's more possible in music than anywhere else.
There's a saying that every love song is the same, but but sadness is very individualistic. What makes me sad? My problem is is my thing, and it's okay to listen to someone sing his or her sad song and feel empathy, but actually I'm not sure if it would work to actually sing a sad song together without reproducing the same problems as in, well, now you're
With the
just
happy one.
producing sadness
Yeah.
and you're just
Yeah.
performing
Yeah,
sadness.
I think that's right. And I think also, and this goes like church music kind of history, one way we talk about what songs or what liturgy does or what the Psalms do. So like St. Ambrose has this phrase, the Psalms are the gymnasium of the soul. So that we pray the Psalms so that we learn how to say and feel faithful things. So it's not that we would just be performing a sadness or some feeling that's not true to us in that moment, but that in doing more than just one thing, we actually get sort of practice in feeling, expressing, sharing those things with God. So again, not just all a monoculture of sad things or a monoculture of happy things, but a diversity of expressions that then gives us, that enables us, empowers us, frees us, or perhaps, hopefully, does those things.
What can we do? What can I do to make worship music more? Ich versuche es auf Deutsch. Diverser zu machen, also dass auch andere Kulturen, kulturelle Einflüsse in die Worship-Musik Einklang finden. Weil wir haben ja jetzt eine große Worship-Industrie, die auch gerade stark aus Amerika kommt. Gibt es dann Möglichkeiten, wie wir hier vor Ort auch andere kulturelle Einflüsse pushen können?
Yeah, I think probably the first thing is to know what those other cultural values are. And one question I like to ask my students is, and not just in different cultural groups, but individuals, what do you love about God? What is it that, and this I think works at the cultural level too, what does a culture love about God? Okay, that's something that we can work with. We can express that love for God, which comes with, accompanying, okay, what is particularly upsetting when God doesn't do, or, you can build out from there. But knowing what feels authentic to a particular community or a particular cultural group in that moment, I think, is the first step, knowing what it is. As a story here, a short anecdote, last year, 2 years ago now, almost 2 years ago, in Nashville, there was a shooting at a school, at an elementary school, a Christian elementary school in particular. And this was just down the road from the university that I work at, a mile and a half down the road, or 2 miles down the road, 4 kilometers or something, 3.5 kilometers. A few weeks after this happened, they had an event, they hosted it at the university, that was called like a night of joy for this community, right? For this church, name of the community. And a bunch of Christian singers and songwriters, people came and like played a song, just one song, and like very performance under erasure. They just came out, sang their thing, like asked God to bless this community and left. I bought a ticket for this. It was like a fundraiser also for the families affected. I bought a ticket and I was very cynical. I thought, how can you have 1 month after this horrific thing, have a night of joy for celebrate the community? And it was inconceivable to me. And a lot of the people who sang were contemporary worship, contemporary Christian music musicians. And I thought, this is the only thing they know how to do. They don't know how to not do a night of joy. There's no other option for them. On one hand, that's one piece. On the other hand, I thought, I also don't know what it's like to be grieving as deeply as they have for the last month And maybe this is something that they, in fact, do deeply need because they've already been doing the work grieving. But I'm not deeply enough involved in that community to know. Of course, I have grief too as extension, but I'm outside the community. So, but I can't know how to support that community without knowing that there is this huge tension probably within the community. And I heard from some folks later and I asked about it. What did they need in that moment? They really needed both things. And what they had available to them was really only the one thing. So there was no communal lament event. There was no group time when everyone got together to lament this thing that happened. It was only the big time to, communal time to celebrate or to have some joy and hope. I wish they had the vocabulary to do both. But their musical and theological resources in that community only made space for the group to express their hope, even if that hope was somewhat marked. Yeah. I don't want to say shallow because I feel a lot of empathy for them, for that community. So anyway, so to say, to know from the inside what feelings are being felt, I think is at least the first part. And if you can't find the resources in the popular songs, this is where local songwriting or where even narrating, speaking in between songs, presenting through prayer or preaching these other kinds of affects, and then also having time where you can sing some, these kinds of songs if that's the repertoire.
So we have a comment in the chat room here from Markus Baum. He says, besides the happy clappy triumph sort of praise and worship, we obviously need, at least in church services, songs of confession and of lament. We have learned this from people like Graham Kendrick in the 1980s. Maybe you'd like to comment on that.
What was the very last sentence?
We have learned this from people like Graham Kendrick in the 1980s.
Yeah, I think that's right, and it makes sense in some ways. Graham Kendrick working in the Anglican context or a broader Anglican context, these different types of songs. I will actually mention him tomorrow a little bit in a different context. But I affirm that comment. I think that's right. Actually, when I first wrote this lecture, I was more, I was writing or thinking a little bit about worship music, emotions, and I was thinking happy clappy in my head, and I realized that's not really characteristic of songs today. They aren't happy clappy. That's not exactly it. They're sort of like feeling full, vaguely, positive, but they're not, I'm not ready to, get excited and rah-rah along. There's a different kind of affect at work. Songs that do things liturgically, I think is an important question for churches in liturgical traditions. To say, how might we use the song for the Great Thanksgiving prayer, or for, one of my absolute favorite songs, a worship artist adjacent setting of the Collect for Purity by Sandra McCracken, this sort of southern folky person, it's so, to me, speaks to the context that I'm in. Almighty God, to you all hearts are open. Come and fill the heart of anxious. It just has this it feels right. It feels like when I pray that prayer, that's the affect I'm feeling normally, and the song does that really well. So instead of reading the Collect for Purity, just bloop, put the song in. It does the song. And actually, in that version of the song, she says, "Come and fill the praises of your people." So informed still by the logic of praise and worship theology, that God would become present in a manifest way through praise. But snuck into the colloquy period, which I think is an interesting, an interesting way of doing things.
May I ask a question myself? Well, two sides. Sorry. There's one. I was in youth ministry, and also the songbook, which was already talking about. This was developed in a very ecumenical space. The youth of Germany got together actually, and was part of the youth of Germany, and tried to really work on what songs they pick. And there was maybe somebody else can comment on that as well. I see a strong tendency at the moment to translate songs, to really sing them in German, and then through the translation, think through the theology. It used to be strong, like in the 90s and early 2000s. It used to be just we want to sing these songs in English, and especially in the congregations, older people would say, "Oh, you only sing English," but that has partially gone away. They really want to translate them and sing them in German. That's one of the things that I see in the German context. The other thing is a question on the theology. I think there is maybe that the way that we have a lack of elaboration talking about the image of God in the churches on the whole. So it reflects that, and of course, I'd like to ask you: is it that the emotion comes first, the theology comes in second place, and through the fact that we don't talk theology also in churches, that lacks in the songs as well. We have a very static, a very theistic image of God, I would say, in a lot of praise and worship songs.
Yeah. Of course, in this lecture, I'm focused on the emotional aspect and what that might tell us about the broader theological impulses, broader theology. I don't know that it's a question of which comes first. I'm not sure how to answer that. So I will ask myself a different question, which is really a bigger one, even a harder one, to say, what is the role of emotion in Christian worship in general? I mean, I'm starting with that assumption that it's good and faithful to bring our emotional lives into worship in general. And I think actually that contemporary worship, contemporary praise and worship is better primed to access this kind of like richer emotional world than the mainline traditions that I'm a part of, because they assume that emotion, that feeling, is already a basic constituent component of worship. Whereas the mainline traditions I've been a part of generally assume that that's not the place. And I would offer to them that that's not maybe a holistic view of what worship is or does, or, we can talk liturgical theology. But so to say, I think, whether it's a first or second question about how we address the emotions thing, which one, do we theologize publicly about God and then invite people to express those things, or recognizing that people bring those things and then work backward? I don't know if it's one thing or the other. But certainly there's a need for both things. The order of operations, I'm not sure about, but I think contemporary worship is better primed to start answering that question, or communities that practice contemporary worship in a rich sense are more primed to start doing that than others. Yeah. Do you want to pass the microphone here?
Yes, as you said, worship and emotion stands in a close relationship each other. And my question is, are there any practical ways to feel the goodness of God if I am, or the people are in during a challenging time from emotions? If I am heightened from emotions, how can I feel the goodness of God more easier?
Yeah, and I think, again, I want to affirm that this, a particular song like this is good on its own. Like, it does a good thing, or it gives voice, represents something that's good. I think the musical capacities of contemporary worship leaders matter a lot when we try to address this question, to say how we might, given whatever's going on in the world, whatever's going on in our local community, how might we, if Goodness of God is scheduled to be played on Sunday morning, how do we find our way into that musically? Maybe we have an intro for Goodness of God that starts somewhere else musically and makes its way to to this more sort of positive. Maybe it's actually chord substitutions in Goodness of God that give it a different feeling and flavor, even as people know how to sing, they're familiar with the song, participate in it. They can, do different things with the same raw material of worship and bring it into a different mood, a different perspective. So, I mean, practically, I think musicians can just do music better, or not better, do music in more innovative or interesting local ways. And then just to say also that I think the speaking potential of worship leaders, I often hear worship leaders like and maybe their pastors don't want them to like speak, but I often hear them only saying things that are relatively meaningless. Okay, congregation, let's stand and sing together, or something that's like not helpful. I mean, what if you started Goodness of God by saying the chord start or whatever, and saying, we celebrate the goodness of God because we believe this and we want this to be the case. And we recognize that not all of us up here feel this way right now, but we hope that in God's time, this prayer becomes true for us too, or something, right? That we might grow to believe this or something. But acknowledging just that it's not uniform, it's not monoculture. Even just saying that starts moving toward that broader sense of feelings that are present.
Thanks for all these interesting questions and important questions. I think we need to ask ourselves, and in particular also developing a local culture of doing worship, but also think of, and I think that also draws in the question by Stefan, that we also have to think of what is the relation between the more reflective speech acts, the discursive ones, right, when we preach or when we read texts, and the one that, like worship, are more addressing emotions and are maybe less content-laden than the other ones. Yeah, thanks for all these interesting questions and the discussion here. It remains for me to say that for those who are following us online, we continue with our lecture series tomorrow at 8:15. We will discuss spiritual warfare as a motive that is transported through worship and worship songs. And then in the afternoon, beginning 1 p.m., we will have a Christian musician, and here it's called Jonas, and he will bring his new album here and presents it to us, but he will also talk about his perception of the German worship culture and the problems with it, and he will also propose a more like localized worship culture that tries out composing as a strategy to actually make worship culture more localized. So I invite you to join that as well. It's going to be interesting musically, but also in terms of what he has to say about worship culture.